We're covering security best practices. This is a very, very broad topic, so I'll further define kind of what I'll be covering. So what I'll be going over is what you can expect to see in terms of who is trying to tactically kind of get crypto from you, what they're trying to do, and then how we can try to address it. So I'll kind of go through that structure, and at the end, I'll leave time for questions. Let's start with kind of what tends to go wrong. So we see a lot of these very large crypto hacks. We see stuff like Poly Network allows billions of dollars in tokens to be printed, or Mixin gets hacked for $200 million, or Wormhole gets hacked for, $375. But what does all this actually mean, right? It means that there's groups there trying to get crypto out of the hands of kind of legitimate enterprises. So who am I? I used to be a software engineer. I became what is called an offensive security person, which really just means I ran some of these operations that you tend to see these kind of criminal groups run, right? So I've gone to infrastructure providers or governments or retailers, hacked into all their stuff, taken everything, done the trophy hunt, gone through all of that. I also do AppSec, which is kind of a different discipline, but that's neither here nor there. Around 2017, I was helping blockchain companies try to be more secure. Some of the biggest, baddest names you've heard of. And then in 2021, I decided to make the pivot almost completely into smart contracts, blockchain, and all of that because the security need was obviously very there. So I also tend to deal with when our portfolio companies get hacked. So some of these are like very apt descriptions of things I may or may not have seen before. So who are all these hackers? It's actually a good question. So I gave them kind of names. So you tend to have a hacker like Phineas. These are real hackers, by the way. They're independent actors. They're very idealistic. They go after specific things to leak things about organizations they don't like. Then you have criminal groups. One criminal group that we can call out from the last 2 years is Lapsus. They were from the UK. They've been arrested. They've been stopped. But what they did in the meantime is kind of go into big enterprises, take as much data as they could, ransom it, and kind of get as much money as they could. Then we have the scarier guys. This is like Lazarus and the mid-level APTs. When we say APT, what we really mean is an organization that is involved with the government in some way, right? Lazarus, in this case, is related to the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, aka North Korea. Then we have the ones we dub with like fun names like Sand Eagle. They're the very, very scary ones. They're the ones you tend to think of when you go, oh, who's hacking everyone? It's probably them. In the case here, we really only care about these two groups, right? We care about the criminal organizations who are trying to get into your enterprises to steal your stuff, and we care about the mid-level nation states who have made it very clear that they're after you, they're after the crypto you have, and they want it pretty bad. So what motivates these groups, right? There's really three things. So in Phineas's case, you have hacktivism, right? They hate an organization so much, they're gonna hack in, they're gonna take everything, they're gonna disclose it to the world, and that's what they're going to do. In the criminal groups and mid-level APTs, we're talking more of this financially motivated criminal activity. So they're trying to steal crypto from you, they're trying to steal credit cards, trying to get your data, they'll ransom it if they have to, they'll sell it, and oddly enough, they're also trying to sell access. So if they get access to your org and some government wants access, they can go to the government and say, hey, here's the access you wanted. Then we have the big guys, the big guns. What are they up to? They're stealing plane secrets, right? They're going, they want to know, like, how is this weapon system built? They can find out. They're surveilling enemies of the state. If they see someone and they're like, hey, I want to know what this person is doing, they just go into their phone, monitor what they're doing, yada, yada. And then they also do destruction campaigns. And this is a very real thing, right? You hear about it in Ukraine. You hear about it being done against Iran. So specifically stuff like Stuxnet, where they go into infrastructure, they destroy it, and that's their whole thing. So again, we're gonna focus on these guys, and specifically this small part, right? Which is they're trying to steal your crypto. So what does this mean for all of us? Well, really, realistically, it means if we have crypto, we're a target. If our organization has crypto, it's a target. If our customer has crypto or customers have crypto, they're a target, right? And we probably should do something about it, at least in terms of what we can. So let's analyze what they're doing. So typically it'd be tools, techniques, and procedures, TTP, but we're really only going to go through the techniques part of this, and we're going to go through it like very high level. If you have an organization and they're trying to operationalize stealing stuff from people, they're going to basically have some set of operations they run. They're going to run them repeatedly, and that's kind of like how they're successful. And in this case, what they'll do is they'll gain access to an asset or an account. They'll see, what is this, like, what data does this have access to? What, like, can I propagate to more access? And can I use this to hack into other things? Like, that's what their interest is. That's what they're going to do. So as we review through this, consider that's what's going through their brain. They're just like, hey, I run this. What's the next step? So the first thing we have in terms of class of attacks is attacks against accounts. So this is typically what you would see, or what you would like see on Twitter. This is your SIM swaps and your password guessing or compromised password usage. So as released, I think yesterday or the day before, SIM swaps are basically someone bribing a mobile employee a few $100s and getting your phone number, right? It's an inevitability. They can do it if they want to. If you're using it to guard something like Twitter, like what happened to Vitalik, they get access to your Twitter. They send out a call that says, hey, people, come to this cool crypto site, and they make $700,000, right? In terms of passwords, something that really illustrates kind of the plight of how passwords have been used in the past is when I used to be doing this professionally all the time, there was kind of a meme, which is like spring 2017, exclamation point, was a really common password in April of 2017. And when I say really common, I mean between 0.5% and 1.5% of all passwords on a network, right? That's an amazingly potent fact, right? So this is something we have to defend against. There will be people who not intentionally misuse how these things work, but as you scale and as you have organizations, you have to be cognizant of these things. Next, we have class of attacks that go after people specifically. So this is two main things. This is phishing, which is trying to kind of get you to do something you're unwilling to do, and bribery, which is trying to pay you to do something for them. The reason I mention bribery is because it is becoming all too common. You may have seen a text before, right? Hey, I'd like to interview you for this really cool job. You just need to download this really weird video conferencing client, right? That's a way for them to try to get on your computer, to use your computer to get access to things. That's an attack against you as an individual, less so you as an organization. But as you get employees, you should expect to see these kinds of operations run against them. And then you have kind of the operational bribery stuff. So this is what's happening at T-Mobile. And this is what happens when kind of you're offboarding someone. So if these guys hear hey, they're about to offboard 50 people, they can just start messaging your people and say, hey, would you like to make a few $1,000s today, right? I just needed you to download this, run this on your computer. Next, we have attack against technologies. So this is what you usually associate with hacking. This is, I have a known vulnerability in something, I weaponize it, and I get access. Or I see something that looks fishy, I find a vulnerability and get access. It is always the case that these groups have the ability to operationalize finding vulnerabilities. So if you have code that's custom written, that hasn't been vetted, that it guards a lot of assets, you can expect them to spend some time trying to break into it, right? On the other side, when you're dealing with bugs that we know about, patching everything all the time and patching it uniformly is very, very difficult, right? It's gotten easier over time, but it's still a thing we all struggle with. So this is something we expect to see operationalized repeatedly and very often. The last one is a little bit more sophisticated. This one is an attack against dependencies. So it may not be they attack you directly. They may go to you through a vendor. So you may have some vendor who's helping you write some software, who's helping you perform some task on behalf of your organization. Well, that makes that vendor a target for some of these groups to get to you specifically, right? So in the case of a Target breach, if you're not familiar, in 2013, all of Target's point of sale systems were compromised. How did they get compromised? Well, they went after an HVAC contractor related to Target, got his information, and then used it to get into all the stores, right? So they go after dependencies, they do this repeatedly, and it is something they're getting much better at, right? The second one, the untold story, that's about SolarWinds. So if you're not aware of what happened to SolarWinds, they got into basically this network security appliance tool that everyone puts on their sensitive networks. They went into the CI system, they put a backdoor into it, so basically they now had access to those sensitive networks. They got access to a ton of things. It was a very, very big deal, right? These are things we see. You, as your smaller companies, shouldn't expect to see this all the time, but you have to be cognizant of it. So now, how do we put this all together? So if I were performing an operation, right, I've described to you a few things you can do, but what actually happens? So this is kind of the typical playbook. So first, you fish or guess your way in, right? Now I have an account, I'm in a network. You scan everything, you try to find a few vulnerabilities, you exploit those systems, you take all the passwords you can off those systems. Once you have the passwords, you propagate out access, and then you just repeat that loop over and over. Eventually, you take the whole enterprise, everything. Then you're on what's called a trophy hunt. You're looking for the things they don't want you to access. And the way you do this typically is you go on to the person who has access to the thing, you camp on their system, and you wait for them to access it. And after you do that, you profit. This is more of a DEF CON-esque meme, but yeah. So how do we think about this problem? So the problem of security is foundationally a prioritization issue, right? You don't have infinite time, but either do the attackers, right? And so what you want to do is prioritize fixing things that are likely to happen, fixing things that are impactful, fixing them as completely as you can, and trying not to annoy people as you kind of go through that process. By doing this, you'll make it a little bit harder for the attackers to attack you, and hopefully, by the time they might be able to get in, they'll lose patience and go somewhere else. In terms of likelihood, it's actually a really hard metric to diagnose, right? Because all these people's goals change over time. And so just at a high level, in terms of my own mental model, here's a set of things you're likely to expect to see, right? You're very likely to see phishing. You're very likely to see a SIM swap. You're pretty likely to see someone's password get guessed. You're decently likely to see kind of a simple smart contract exploit. You're less likely to see a disgruntled employee give someone access to your network. You're way less likely to have a vendor compromised. And the worst case is you're very unlikely to make someone mad enough that they will spend as much time as it takes to get into your system, to break into everything, and to take everything, which is absolutely to be avoided. In terms of impact's easy to kind of think about casually, but realistically, it's actually difficult to quantify. The reason here is that access kind of begets access. So once they get access into your network or access to your assets, they're trying to get more, right? And you either need to catch them and get them out, or they'll continue to get it. And so once they kind of get their hooks in, you can kind of expect them to try to get more and to, in all honesty, usually get there, right? And so when we're thinking about this, we want to consider three things. We want to consider if they can compromise accounts that are unrelated to our business, mostly related to ourselves. So this is social media, iCloud, Google account backups if you're not running G Suite as your corporate email. These are things like your corporate emails, your corporate networks if you have them, and your corporate cloud accounts, as well as access to crypto funds. As we remember from their motivations, that's what they're after. If they get access, they will leverage it. They have done that repeatedly. They'll continue to do that. So in terms of prioritization, Let's kind of just go through it just one after another. If we're afraid of an employee password getting guessed, how do we fix it? Well, is this likely? According to the mental model, it's decently likely. So say we have a VPN. They can log into it and get into our corporate network. So how do we keep this from being a problem? So we can do something like impose that multi-factor be used on the VPN, but once we do that, what does that actually fix? It makes sure they can't get on our network, but chances are if it's a corporate account, it doesn't make sure they can't access the corporate account, right? They may get access to emails. They may use that to get more data on us. They may use that to basically phish others, to try to convince them, hey, I'm having trouble with this, running this, can you help me, right? You kind of wanted to avoid that, so you go to the more complete option, which is to just have MFA on your corporate account, right? It's useless to guess a password if you also have a code or preferably a key, right? Like one of these attached to your account. Next, let's go through something like N days. So an N day is a known vulnerability. You've had N number of days to patch it. So if we have or suspect we have a vulnerability on our perimeter, right? This is either perimeter of our cloud environment or perimeter of our company as a whole, and we know it's there, or we know it's probably there. What can we do to reduce the likelihood or reduce the impact, right? We can obviously try to restrict network access, but in a lot of cases, the reason that service is up is because it can't, like it serves some purpose, it can't be restricted. So then we go, okay, if it can't be restricted, can we at least enable that it gets updates repeatedly, right? That it gets auto-updated, that we can make sure that we're not like holding old vulnerabilities in the software. That tends to work, right? But it's not always available, right? I'm sure all of you know of software packages you use, things you put up, and guess what? Like, do they update every night? No, right? Can you make them update every night? Maybe. That's another point. But then you have the case where like, what if it can't update it, right? What if it doesn't have updates or it's not really feasible? Then I just try to reduce the impact. So you take the service and you put it in its own little network, right? It can't touch anything. It feels better, right? All these are options. Obviously, who knows what fits our business best? But like, this is kind of the process we should think about these things in. So let's go through what we should do about each of the kind of attacks that we've stated earlier. I'm gonna go through all of them, and I'm specifically gonna go through them on what you should do for yourself, what you should do for your company, and then what you should do for your customers. And this has three main assumptions. One, you can impose really gnarly restrictions on yourself because you can hold yourself to them. You can impose restrictions on your employees, but they have to be sane, right? They have to understand the utility of the restriction. Otherwise, they're gonna actively bypass it. That's what we tend to see. And for customers, it's honestly just really hard to restrict them, right? You have to do more kind of enablement activities, or you have to make sure that like you're just not the source of the failure. So attacks against accounts. If we remember, these are attacks like SIM swapping and brute forcing. So what do? Stop using SMS for everything, literally. If you use SMS for authentication and you can get away from it, it needs to be removed, right? This includes Twitter. This doesn't really include iCloud, but there's a different way to address that. Like, you need to do this, right? They've shown, hey, we can get access to your phone number. When they get access to your phone number, that needs to not yield access to your account. Another thing you do for this is try not to get your password guessed. So you use unique passwords, right? Typically in the form of like having some password vault. Obviously, this only pertains to accounts that like are important. So your Netflix account or some other account that really doesn't matter if they took it, you can be less careful there. I would say generally try to use unique passwords in all of these places, but it's not as important. And then you have hardening account recovery. So I mentioned iCloud earlier. iCloud uses SMS for account recovery. iCloud, you can't really remove your phone number, right? It would make your texts go green or kind of do some weird stuff. And so because we don't want to do that, what we have to do instead is harden the account recovery. And we'll go over that a little bit later. And the last one, and probably the most important, is multi-factor auth. So if you don't want to mess up, you have multi-factor auth. Pretty simple. For your employees, again, we can't be as draconian with what we have to implement. So we just tell them use multi-factor auth. And we try as much as we can to use single sign-on to enforce that authentication across most of the services we have is as uniform as possible. For your customers, this is a harder part. How do you make sure your customer's password's not guessed? How do you make sure your customer doesn't get hacked? You just try, right? So standard right now is to basically, on first login, send them an OTP, say, hey, you have this thing. If you're using crypto for login, it's probably not as big of a deal because they're not likely to guess it, right? Notify them on new login. It's always good practice, yada, yada. Yeah, feels pretty boring. So attack against people. So for you, yourself, you just need to be aware, right? If someone sends you a weird inbound and says, hey, can you click this thing for me? Your answer probably should be no, right? Past that, you're looking at specialized forms of authentication, usually using things like YubiKeys, right? Universal two-factor. Typically what you want is WebAuthn, and this will keep it so like even if you're phished for your password, you put in WebAuthn, it signs using the domain you're at, meaning that isn't a good signature for logging in as you. Lastly, you should actively consider AV, especially for the less technical users. It is hard for me to say this because I personally don't like antivirus, but it does have utility, right? If you're running a Windows machine, don't disable Defender, right? That's just the way it works. For your business, obviously you want awareness on all your employees. You have to kind of tell them. That's not easy. It takes a while. Everyone finds it boring. Same thing with U2F, right? Get your employees these little keys, make phishing them harder. Then we enter the part where they are compromised via bribery or some other vector, right? You have to be careful who you hire. You have to know who they are. You have to know what they're doing. If you don't know those things, they could be anyone, right? And that exposes you to a lot of risk. Same when you let people go. If you're letting someone go, as sad as it is to say, revoke access first, right? You can call them on the phone later. It feels really, really bad, but it keeps them from giving access to your network intentionally. Like that is the main purpose. So if you really, really trust them, sure, maybe you circumvent some of these, but if you're really trying to make sure this isn't a problem, you get a little bit worse. And then lastly, again, I don't like antivirus personally, but it does do something, right? It makes it harder to hack into stuff. It makes it harder to perform operations. So it's always a good thing. For your customers, when you're looking at how this affects your customers, you're not trying to not get your customer phished. You're trying to make sure you're not the source of phishing, right? The way you do this is you make sure your social media accounts are on point, right? Multi-factor. Make sure that's not using SMS so they can recover it. Make sure all these things are just as buttoned down as you can because they're going to use them to phish customers, right? Same for email. SPF and DKIM are preventative measures that basically let you tell the internet who can send emails on your behalf. For all your domains, this should be there, right? The reason, because you don't want them to just send a random email from a random domain you have and say, hey, we're doing a new airdrop. Click here to find more, right? And then lastly, and this is kind of a long tail thing, you have to protect your customers from your employees. So if you're gathering a bunch of customer data and you have a treasure trove of it, you need to some extent restrict your own employees from viewing it, taking it, and like throwing it out, right? This kind of is a sad truth, but that's how it works. For technology, right, I've already mentioned this. You need everything to update. You need to auto-update it. You need to update it manually. You need to not download things that look really sketchy, right? If you're doing any of these things, you're gonna get caught, right? And lastly, something that actually does help quite a bit is if you're using systems with app isolation, it's much harder to use malware to propagate out, right? This also affects phishing, but I just put it here. For your business, obviously, you need to update stuff. You need to keep track of advisories and update when you see them. You need to make sure that the configuration of your servers is uniform, right? This is where configuration management comes in. This is, again, another long tail thing that you think about eventually. And then we have a whole discipline of trying to keep your code from having vulnerabilities. It's called AppSec. Really, for you guys, we're just talking about test your code, have someone review it, right? That's the bar you're going for, right? And for your customers, if you build something your customer gets, make sure they can update it. Make sure either you can keep it up to date or you'll tell them, hey, there's been an advisory, please update your stuff. This is very important, right? As much as we go, oh, like maybe it's not going to affect them, maybe it's not going to do this, like we have breaches that are almost completely sourced on the failure to tell someone that something went wrong. So next, we have dependencies. For this first one, I just needed to put a bullet. So for yourself, you don't have enough dependencies typically for this to matter. For your business, just keep track of what they are and do vendor due diligence. So as you onboard vendors to do important tasks for you, or as they get access to your data or your contracts or whatever you're giving them access to, make sure they're who they claim to be, make sure they are doing what they need to, and make sure they're reputable, right? And for your customer, don't be the source of the dependency failure, right? Harden your entire build process, right? Make sure it's hard to get code into your GitHub, make sure it's hard to build, make sure it's hard to kind of backdoor and deploy. There's some extras. These are mostly around spotting people if it happens, or if the worst happens, what to do. They're pretty simple. Gather logs. You eventually want to analyze them, but start gathering them. It's probably important. Be able to recover data. In the case you get ransomware, like the easiest way to get past it is to essentially go, hey, I have this data, it's over here. But along with a backup of data, you have to restrict that data. There are hacks that are literally just, hey, I went in and found their backup and I just stole their backup, right? And then incident response is important, and you really just need to answer one question. It's like, who are you going to call if shit hits the fan, right? And if you can't answer that question, find out who it is, right? I was asked to kind of include this stuff as well. Audits are important. The reason they're important is the following. People who get hacked think the way they got hacked wouldn't happen, right? They thought, hey, I have controls around this whole process. This should have never happened. Why did it happen? Because mistakes happen, right? It's very easy to just, as you're going through things, to just skip one step, and that one step bites you. And that one mistake, they will find it, right? And so you need to get your system reviewed. You need to, as you make these big changes and you have very important controls, to verify those controls are in place, right? Because it's very easy for you to kind of kick it down the road or think like, I kind of have it, but I'm not exactly sure. That's not good enough. Next, how do you get an audit? It's a fairly simple process. It's actually more involved than this, but I'm gonna kind of shortcut it here. So find someone good or ask people, and they'll find someone good for you. Reserve some of their time, and then they'll give you a report and you fix the things, right? As simple as that. It costs a lot of money. It sucks to do sometimes, but it's kind of a necessary evil. So to wrap it up, let's go through a more involved demonstration. So let's all take out our phone. Open up Twitter, go to your profile, hit settings and privacy, go to your account information, and check to see if you have a phone number. If you do, and you don't need it, just right now, click on it and say delete phone number. The reason you're doing this is because this is how they get access to your Twitter. Exactly this is exactly what's gonna happen, right? And it's this simple to fix. So we're fixing it now, and we're just gonna make sure you're not gonna have a problem in the future. Next, people with iPhones. Go to settings, click on iCloud. This may take a little while. Click sign in security, scroll down, hit account recovery, and check to see what recovery key says. If that says off, don't turn it on right now, because it does involve writing something down and making sure all that's there. But take a note right now. If this isn't on, they can SIM swap and steal your iCloud immediately, right? And they will, and they'll keep it, right? So if you want to avoid that problem, do this. Next, if you don't have some of these little U2F keys, get a few. Use them for all your logins. Anyone who accepts them, they should. You may need two, one as a backup, but they're very important. And then lastly, make sure auto updates are on. This is how you do it on your iPhone. You go into settings, you hit general, you hit a software update, and if it says automatic updates on, which it should, then you're probably good. And then once you're kind of at this posture, what we've now done is we're protecting your Twitter from being hijacked, we're protecting your iCloud from being hijacked, and we're making sure that it's going to be very hard to hack into your phone. So you can depend on your phone to be your secured device, right? If you have any worries or someone's like, hey, can you download this sketchy like video conference app, use your phone, right? As weird as that is to say, it has app isolation. You use it, you delete it later, hopefully no effect there. If they have a 0-day, they're not going to use it on you unless you have a lot of money. Lastly, and just to restate, and this feels really bad to say, everyone's going to get hacked sometime, right? We all have it. The hope is the way you get hacked is someone accesses your Netflix, right? That sucks, but not really. And so what we've done is we've made it just a little bit harder for attackers, right? And you want to continue to do that as you move forward, and especially as you scale. And again, if you need help, please ask, right? This is very important. We aim to kind of keep everything good, and like there are no stupid questions. So with that, do you have any questions?
First question, just rolling back straight to audits, right?
Yep.
So I'm familiar with like payment card industry, DSS, with like paying Trustkeeper or someone to automatically scan your website and look for vulnerabilities. But like there's also smart contract audits. So I was wondering if you could speak to like the types of audits, like by category, we should be thinking about.
The question really boils down to how good of an audit do I need to get for which types of systems? For smart contracts, the answer is a good one, right? Unless it's a smart contract that basically you didn't write, that's written with a bunch of different dependencies that are already really well vetted, then it has to be reviewed thoroughly and like very well. Unless, of course, it just doesn't matter, right? There are those cases. For something like your website, right, it may be important. It depends on what your users are doing on it. If your users are using crypto wallets and signing stuff and trusting you to tell them what they should and shouldn't do, that needs to be audited, right? Fairly thoroughly, but not quite to the extent that like a smart contract would need to be. And then lastly, you have kind of like your tangentially related apps. So let's say like you built an app, it's not doing anything with crypto, it's just users talking to one another, doing that kind of thing. At that point, this is a due diligence question. So you don't want to leak data, you obviously don't want to get hacked, but there's not as much risk there, right? As I mentioned, they're targeting crypto, right? If there's no crypto on the site, why are you that worried? And so you can kind of scale with that question, is like, how much do they get out of hacking me on this platform? And if it's a lot, you have to do a lot to guard it. So hopefully that answers your question.
Are all YubiKeys unique, or do you have to back, or are they all, can you back one up to another essentially? And
So-
if not, is 2 enough?
So they do have, like at an enterprise level, you can get ones that are flashed with the same thing, and you can get configurable ones that you can flash with certain keys, right? So you can make 2 YubiKeys that can sign identically. Realistically, you as an individual, what you're really going to do is like just have 2, right? You're gonna roll both of them, right? You're gonna store one in like a safe, away from your house, away from kind of like where we normally get stolen. Safety deposit boxes are your friend. And then you're gonna carry one on you. And like that's what you're gonna use to authenticate. And that's typically like what should insulate you. If you need kind of a third factor, right? TOTP is fine. It's just you want to avoid using it all the time, right? You want to avoid pulling out your phone and putting in a code because that is something they can phish. And so it's just materially weaker than using your YubiKey. So you want to use the most secure thing you have. And like if you really need backups, you can back up to things that are mostly secure, but like you have to consider what the point of them is.
Okay, so this is just a real life thing. So one time I was put in front of a compromised system. We noticed that there was an ongoing problem, and they had been attacking the Apache logs themselves and changing the logs so no one would notice what was going on.
Yep.
So are there any like good practices for the moment logging events occur, like offload that off the machine? Like what do you guys think about that?
So most of the log aggregators do that. So what they're doing is they're monitoring the files, and as they're appended to, they take that information and send it to a log aggregation server. And so as long as they're not keeping the file from being written to, right, which they can do, then you're going to see log generation. And if log generation stops it might indicate something happened, right? And if you're building alerts out for these systems, and this is kind of like a longer conversation, then you also want to know that liveness is there, right? If every metric says this Apache server is here, but no logs are coming to my server, that's a very big red flag, right? And that's like something you have to consider. So when I say get logs, I don't just mean get logs. I mean get logs, have some log aggregation tool, push them over, and then later monitor the logs for kind of anomalous events.
Again, on the topic of audits, what do you think of crowdsourcing the audits to something like Code4 Arena or other platforms which are like competition based? Like any practical experience from seeing teams get their smart contracts hacked, which have been audited in a crowdsourced way versus like a dedicated auditor? I guess that's a case by case thing, but maybe like general, yeah.
I can
rules
give
thumb.
kind of a good example, right? We have examples of code that has been audited by like a single firm getting hacked, right? Those will happen, right? We don't have as many examples of the crowd audits stuff getting hacked. The key with crowd audits, and like the thing that makes them a little weirder to use, is if your code isn't like really up to snuff, you're going to receive like 150 issues. They're all going to be pointing in different directions, and they're all going to be asking for different fixes. And you have to sit there, navigate through them all, think about how do I fix this like realistically, and then after you do it, you need another audit to make sure you did it, right? And so it just takes time when you're building that. If you're pretty mature with your coding process and you have like an independent reviewer who reviewed something, a crowd audit is always good, right? A crowd audit finds a lot of things. It addresses a ton of edge cases, right? They've been very effective, right? If they become less effective, like I'll note that, but right now, like they stand as one of the more kind of like easy things for you to do. Again, the issue is fixing the issues they give to you and making sure like they're fixed in a way that like keeps everything kind of stable. So that's typically what I see. And so like, yeah, they end up being really good.
Would love to hear your take, just, given security expertise, what's the best place to store a private key? And I mean that like partially like it's, a joke, but like, I think it's important of like, do you think it's safer on a piece of paper, under your bed, in an iCloud, or like in a, something that you think is more secure that's digital? Curious what your take is.
So if you need a
true crypto private
cold
key.
storage crypto key, right? So a crypto key I don't need to use, right? You can encrypt that key, print it out on paper, store that paper somewhere safe. Well, how do you store the encryption key? Well, that should be backed somewhere in either an HSM that you have or some other kind of like hardware device that's not gonna like let them exfiltrate it, right? That could potentially be your phone, but like that's pretty risky. As the funds grow, your phone isn't a good place to be doing that. But typically, like if you're going for maximum safety with like minimum usability, right? Like that's kind of the way you typically approach it. If you're going for things you can still use, right? Hardware wallets tend to be pretty good still. There are some, like I have some qualms with some of the manufacturers and the way they manage their firmware and the way you update it and whether or not they have access to your keys, right? But a trusted manufacturer with a good reputation and kind of going through that, hardware wallet that does that is probably like as good as you're gonna get for like a warm or hot wallet.
I would be curious to hear your perspective of audits versus bounty programs, and if like there are different instruments for different use cases. Like, for example, like alting a blockchain could be maybe like very hard to audit, and perhaps like a bounty program makes sense. Just curious to hear your perspective.
Yeah, so when you're talking about very complex bugs and bugs that are like manifestations of technical debt through deployment cycles, that would be something that's really hard to spot in like a standalone audit. This is where bug bounties excel, right? And realistically, you should be willing and able to pay someone money if they can tell you how they would steal all your money, right? This needs to be something you're willing to do. It probably needs to be something you can advertise you're willing to do. And so the bounty projects are a good way to do this. You can also just advertise it on your project page, right? You can say, hey, listen, contact us here. We will give you a reward. Here's the maximum amount we're advertising. And like, we're gonna go through this. So that's kind of my mental model of it, is the bug bounties are really good at catching things that are weird. They're really good at catching things and incentivizing people to go through your stuff after the fact, after the deployment. They're not a substitute for audits per se, especially if you're not confident in the quality of your code when it's kind of created, right? And audit's there to kind of help shore that up. But in terms of like unknown vulnerabilities, other kind of weird stuff, that's where the bug bounties excel. So if you're a big enough project, and especially if you're a blockchain, bug bounty is exceptionally good at incentivizing people to, instead of stealing your money, to hand you the bug and just have you give them money for it. So it's worked exceptionally well. The hacks that we've seen kind of drop in the last year, partially is going to be crypto winter, but partially is going to be the fact that like people have paid probably $100 million to avoid having another billion stolen.